Today we talk about 5 things from Star Wars Legends that should be reintroduced into canon. Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video. Today we'll be talking about 5 things from Star Wars Legends that should be re-canonized. This video will be a bit more rambly than usual. I'm just going to be talking about basically 5 of my favorite things that I think would fit into the new stories. Now, in making this video, I'm not saying that Star Wars Legends is better than canon or vice versa, because surely I could think of 5 things in Star Wars canon that could have worked well in Star Wars Legends. So just keep that in mind as we go through. With that being said, let's get started with number 1, which is more ship variation. One of the great things about Star Wars Legends is they weren't afraid to introduce new ship types, even if it was in a reference book. I think the best way to illustrate this is with the Imperial Navy. In Star Wars canon, the Empire really has their Star Destroyer line, a few smaller ship types, then their Executor class Super Star Destroyer. In Legends, not only were there various Super Star Destroyer types, like the Bellator or the Assertor, but there were also battleships, which were larger than a Star Destroyer, but smaller than a Dreadnought. I think that this is in a way realistic, while still maintaining the sort of Star Wars feel. I hope that at some point we get an essential guide to vehicles or ships for the new Star Wars canon, which drastically expands the scope of the Empire's military. Sure, it doesn't mean that much for story, but to me, that would be a big step forward in terms of world building. I would also like to see a bit more focus on the smaller ships of the Empire. For example, the Carrack class or the Lancer class or the Dreadnought class, all those ships that were really well known within Star Wars Legends. I think the only work that's really done that well is the Thrawn book, where at certain points he's stationed on various small ships. That being said, this point isn't just limited to the Empire. I will say the new canon has done a somewhat good job of expanding the arsenal of the Rebel Alliance, but I'd like to see something similar done with not only the Republic, but also the New Republic, and hopefully we see their fleet kind of fleshed out a bit more, even though it was seemingly annihilated in The Force Awakens. Number 2 is more minor conflicts, and when I say this, I'm thinking especially of the 30 years between Return of the Jedi and the sequel trilogy. When I say a minor conflict, what I mean is something kind of independent, a one-off arc, stuff that we saw in the Thrawn trilogy or perhaps the Rogue Squadron series of the X-Wing books. It doesn't only need to be Imperial remnant factions. I think, for example, of the truce at Bakura, where the Rebel Alliance and the Empire fight the Sea Rook. These are basically just opportunities for our heroes to go on an adventure without the main story being altered in any sort of crazy way. Again, if we look at the space between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, there's 30 years where stories can be told. You can have a bunch of little events where, the characters learn something, they defeat an enemy, and they can even build upon each other. All of this without diverting too far away from where the story needs to go. Admittedly, I know some fans don't like these sort of throwaway stories as much as I do, but it really helps again with the world building and getting a better sense of familiarity with all of the characters. The weakest part of those stories was the fact that they really couldn't talk about anything in the prequel territory, and there was a seemingly lack of overall coherence. Both of those could be fixed with new stories, and I really think there's an opportunity for something special there. One of the things that made the Thrawn trilogy so great was that all of the main characters were used, something actually interesting happened, and of course Thrawn as a character was so compelling. One of the main reasons I believe that some of the new canon works have been underwhelming is because certain characters and certain topics are off limit. I'd like just at least one story where Luke and the gang come together to solve some sort of issue. Now that Luke Skywalker's story has reached a new point with The Last Jedi, hopefully they can expand into his past somewhat. Overall, hopefully we can have some sort of story with all of the characters we want, where there's some new major plot points being addressed and disposed of. Number 3 is more video game stories. This is probably the worst thing Disney has done since their purchase of Lucasfilm. However, to be fair, there's not been a major Star Wars video game, I believe, at least a story-centered game, since The Force Unleashed 2, at least until the new Star Wars Battlefront. There's such a good opportunity for storytelling in video games. Think of Knights of the Old Republic 1 or 2, Shadows of the Empire, even the story of Kyle Katarn, all told at least partially through video games. Yes, we have had Star Wars Battlefront 2, however in my mind that story was underwhelming, although it did do a good job of tying in and having references to other expanded universe material. Other than that, Disney really has seemingly been focusing mostly on mobile games, which don't tell any story whatsoever most of the time. I don't care whether it's an RPG or an action game or whatever else, but I would really like to see storytelling return to video games for the Star Wars universe. I mean, it would just print money, I would think, although, from what I understand, video game development now, especially not multiplayer-focused development, has become very expensive, which I'm sure partially explains the lack of new content. The fourth thing that I think Star Wars canon should learn from Star Wars Legends is more lovable and important side characters. I really like it when characters, even if they're not the protagonist, appear again and again in Star Wars works. They can be very important at times and even close to protagonist level. I'm thinking, for example, Talon Karrde and Garmbel Iblis. These two characters are very important, they're well written, and even after they're introduced in the Thrawn trilogy, continue to reappear again and again in various Star Wars works. I'm also thinking of characters like Borsk Phalia, who aren't necessarily lovable, but are still an important part of the world building. Now, admittedly, several characters have appeared through various works, for example, Dr. Aphra, but I don't think I've cared about any, at least non-original or prequel trilogy characters, as much as, say, Winter, or even more main characters like Corran Horn or Kip Duron. I think you can make a fair criticism of the expanded universe that sometimes the interconnectivity was a bit too much, but I think the new canon takes it a bit too far in the opposite direction. We need to find some sort of sweet spot where the world building doesn't suffer in either direction. I will mention one thing I'd personally like to see, but the final of the main 5 suggestions is very similar to the last one. More important secondary factions. I've already talked about the Cyrook, but I'd like to say more of, say, the Mon Calamari as a species in the Chiss, and perhaps the reintroduction of the Hapes Consortium. It doesn't always need to be either Empire, Rebels, New Republic, Resistance, etc., etc. It's sometimes okay to have a not main faction be the focal point of a story, and that goes back to not only more important secondary characters, but also more one-off adventures. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory, so I'll leave it at that. Now we're going to talk about just one thing that I personally would like to see more in the Star Wars canon, but I don't think the vast majority of people would. That's more weird stuff. Now, a lot of this came from the old Star Wars daily comic books, or some of the very early Star Wars books, so I don't think it's likely that we get the same level of just bizarreness in the new Star Wars canon as we did with Star Wars Legends. We're talking about interdimensional entities or, other galaxies, and to be fair, a lot of that stuff, like Waru, wasn't necessarily good, but it's just one thing that I liked in my Star Wars canon. It's also difficult because there's not really tiered levels of canon like there was back in the day, so Han and Leia encountering some sort of demigod would be just as canon as something that happens in one of the main movies, and clearly there is some issue with that, and I totally understand why there's been less strangeness in the new Star Wars movies, but I do miss it. I hope on at least one occasion they go to a different galaxy. I know there has been some stuff with dimensions, but I would really like just more weird creatures, more weird things, more weird events, some truly fantasy stuff in my Star Wars. But again, I'm not including that in the 5 main suggestions that I have. Again, just to recount, that was more ship variation, more lovable and important side characters, more video game stories, more minor conflicts, and more important secondary factions. But that's just my opinion. Let me know down in the comments what you think Star Wars canon should take from Star Wars Legends. I do just want to reiterate that I didn't make this video to crap on Star Wars canon, and I'm not saying that Star Wars Legends is necessarily better. Ultimately, it's up to preference in which storyline you prefer more. As I said at the beginning, Star Wars canon has done several things better than Star Wars Legends. Perhaps in the future I'll do a whole video on that once the universe is a bit more developed. I will say that either way, I am excited for the future 30 years of Star Wars and having a lot of these things I've talked about be more fleshed out in the current canon. Anyway guys, this was EckhartsLadder. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a bit more rambly, it wasn't scripted out, and I kind of just wanted to talk my mind. If you guys liked it, make sure to give a like and let me know down in the comments. Anyway, until next time guys, as always, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.